The Mafia boss asked the black maid for advice as a joke. But her words changed his life. The sun had barely set when the noise in the grand mansion grew louder. In the luxurious dining room, the clinking of fine china and crystal glasses reverberated in the air. The Mafia boss, Dominic Castellano, sat at the head of the table, his sharp eyes scanning the room. His suit, tailored to perfection, gleamed under the chandeliers, and the expensive cologne he wore lingered in the air. He was a man of power, feared by all who crossed his path, respected by even the most dangerous of men. The table was full of his associates, all sipping on their drinks and conversing in hushed tones. But amidst all the power, the whispers of respect, there was one figure who was always in the background, unnoticed. Lila, the black maid. She moved silently, setting down a dish here, refilling a glass there, her movements graceful yet invisible. Lila was used to being ignored, used to being in the background. She had learned the art of silence early on, the art of being unseen. It was safer that way. But today, something felt different. She could feel the tension in the air. The usual chatter was replaced with silence as the men in the room exchanged glances. Dominic Castellano, the feared Mafia boss, had just asked her a question. "Lila," he said, his voice dripping with amusement, "how would you handle a business deal if the odds were against you? If someone was trying to double-cross you?" His voice was casual, almost joking, but the words hung in the air like a challenge. The room fell silent. All eyes were on her. Dominic had asked her a question as if she was part of the inner circle, as if her opinion mattered. It wasn't the first time she'd been in the room with him, but it was the first time he had ever addressed her directly. Lila, who had spent years serving in the shadows, was now the center of attention. She knew this was not just a simple question. It was a test. The room waited. Dominic watched her with a smirk on his face, amused by the thought of someone like Lila giving him advice. Lila swallowed hard, her heart racing. This was not the time to be silent. This was not the time to hide behind her status. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, waiting for her response. She took a deep breath, her hands steadying as she placed the wine bottle down on the table. "If I were you," she said slowly, her voice calm and measured, "I would not waste time on revenge. I would outsmart them. Look for the weak points in their strategy and turn the tables. You see, power is not just about brute force. It's about knowing when and how to strike." There was a pause. A long one. Dominic's smirk faltered. His eyes narrowed as he processed her words. It wasn't the answer he had expected. The room was quiet, the weight of her words hanging in the air. This was not a maid speaking. This was someone who understood strategy, who understood power. The men around the table exchanged uncertain glances. They were used to Dominic's decisiveness, his ability to always be in control. But Lila's words had shaken him. He sat back in his chair, his mind racing. For the first time, he wondered if he had misjudged her. The maid, the woman he had overlooked for so long, had just given him advice that made him rethink everything. She had changed the game, and he hadn't even seen it coming. The air in the grand dining room grew thick with tension after Lila's words. Dominic Castellano, the feared Mafia boss, sat in his seat, stunned. His usual air of control and power faltered for a brief moment as he processed what Lila had just said. For years, he had been the one making decisions, the one giving orders. Yet, here was a maid, someone from a completely different world, telling him that power wasn't about brute force but about strategy, intelligence, and subtlety. It was a harsh truth he had never fully considered. The other men around the table had gone silent. The usual sounds of clinking glasses and murmured conversations were replaced by an awkward stillness. Dominic's mind raced. He had faced countless enemies, dealt with betrayals, and navigated the cutthroat world of organized crime with unshakable confidence. But now, in this moment, he realized that maybe he had missed something crucial in his approach. He had never thought to look at power from a different angle, one that didn't rely solely on intimidation. As he stared at Lila, his mind began to shift. He leaned forward, his piercing gaze locked onto hers. "You're telling me that I've been doing it all wrong." His voice was low, a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Lila, still standing by the table, met his gaze without flinching. She had always been invisible to these people, merely a servant in their eyes. But something had shifted. This was no longer about just giving a simple answer. It was about showing them that she was more than just the maid who cleaned their rooms and served their meals. She was someone with knowledge, with a mind capable of understanding things far beyond her station. No, she replied calmly. I'm not saying you're doing it all wrong, but maybe there's a different way to think about it. Power isn't just about muscle or fear. It's about influence, about knowing your enemy and using their weaknesses against them. Dominic sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. The room was quiet, and for the first time in years, he felt as though he was the one being tested. Lila's words had gotten under his skin in a way no one else's had. He had heard similar advice before, but never from someone like her. He glanced around the table at his associates. They all seemed to be watching him, waiting for him to respond. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, Dominic broke it. And how would you handle it? He asked, his voice still holding a note of disbelief, but with a new edge. Lila's heart raced, but she didn't show it. I would find a way to turn the situation in my favor, she said, her voice steady. People underestimate those they think are powerless. That's where the real strength lies. There was a moment of silence as the weight of her words settled in. The other men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were used to the Mafia boss being the one with all the answers, the one who never questioned his authority. But now, they were seeing something different. Lila had made them all rethink their assumptions. Dominic, however, seemed to be absorbing her words more deeply than anyone else. His eyes narrowed thoughtfully as he studied her. He could see the intelligence in her gaze, the confidence that was so different from the timid woman who had served him for so long. Something inside him stirred. You have a sharp mind, he said, almost to himself. I've never noticed it before. Lila didn't respond, but she could feel the shift. It wasn't just about the words now. It was about respect. For the first time, Dominic Castellano was looking at her as something more than just the help. He was seeing her as a person, as someone who could offer insight into the world he had spent his life navigating. As the night continued, Dominic couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened. He had never expected to hear the kind of advice that Lila had given him, let alone from someone in her position. And while he wasn't about to completely change his approach overnight, he knew one thing for certain. Lila had opened his eyes to a new way of thinking, and that would never be forgotten. The next few days were filled with the usual chaos of his world, but Dominic found himself repeatedly replaying the conversation in his mind. He couldn't help but wonder what else Lila might know, what other insights she had to offer. He hadn't been this intrigued in years. But there was more to this than just curiosity. There was something about her confidence, the way she had so effortlessly commanded his attention, that stirred something inside him. He was starting to see her as more than just a maid. And that, for Dominic Castellano, was a dangerous thought. The next few days after the conversation were not as smooth as Dominic had expected. The tension in the air at the mansion had shifted subtly, but it was there. His usual cold and calculating demeanor seemed a little less sharp, his thoughts distracted by Lila's words. Every time he entered the mansion's grand hall, he couldn't help but look at her differently. She was no longer just the maid. She had become an enigma, a mystery that had unexpectedly entered his life and made him question everything he thought he knew about power and control. Lila, on the other hand, remained silent about their conversation. She had always known her place in the world, had always been careful not to draw attention to herself. But something about Dominic's reaction to her advice made her wonder if there could be more to her life than this. It was strange to think that a simple conversation could alter her perspective. She had never considered herself important, but now, in the days following their talk, she found herself walking through the halls with her head held a little higher, her steps more assured. She had not been this visible in the mansion ever before, and it felt oddly empowering. Dominic, who was used to people fearing him, now found himself increasingly drawn to her. There were moments when he'd catch her in a quiet corner of the mansion, deep in thought as she went about her duties. He wondered what was going on inside her mind. The sharpness she had shown him was not typical for someone in her position. It intrigued him. As he sat in his office one evening, a manila folder in front of him containing crucial information about his current business dealings, his thoughts wandered back to Lila's words. He had dealt with enemies his whole life, but Lila had been the first person to make him consider that maybe he had been approaching things all wrong. Could power truly be about more than just intimidation? He was not used to doubting himself. But there was something in the way Lila had spoken, her calmness, her confidence. It had shaken him in a way he couldn't explain. He could hear her voice in his mind now. Power isn't just about muscle or fear. It's about influence. He stood up from his desk and walked to the large windows of his office, overlooking the city below. The soft glow of the streetlights reminded him of the vast empire he had built, yet the weight of her words made him feel suddenly small, as if all he had built was fragile and precarious. After that night, Dominic decided to test Lila's theory. He had an important meeting scheduled with a rival gang. For years, he had handled these meetings the same way: intimidation, force, fear. But now, something inside him was pushing him to approach it differently. He couldn't shake the thought of Lila's advice, and for once, he decided to try to outthink his enemies instead of overpowering them. The meeting was set in a nondescript warehouse at the edge of town, a place that had always been neutral ground between rivals. As Dominic walked in, flanked by his trusted bodyguards, he was ready for the usual exchange: threats, anger, and a tense negotiation. However, something unexpected happened. Instead of immediately pushing for the upper hand, Dominic decided to play the long game. He listened. He asked questions. He stayed calm and measured, his mind working as he observed his enemies. It was a stark contrast to the usual brute force he would have employed. The rival gang leaders were caught off guard. They had expected a confrontation, but instead, Dominic was offering a level of diplomacy they were not accustomed to. The meeting went smoother than he had imagined, and in the end, Dominic was able to strike a deal that benefited him, without shedding a drop of blood. As he left the meeting, Dominic felt a sense of satisfaction he had never experienced before. He had won, but not by the usual means. He had done it through strategy, through understanding. And for the first time, he realized that Lila had been right. It wasn't just about force. It was about knowing when and how to strike, when to hold back and when to act. The next morning, Dominic found himself walking into the mansion's kitchen. Lila was there, preparing breakfast as usual. The sun had barely risen, and the early morning light streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over everything. Dominic stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her work. She seemed focused, calm, and unaware of his presence. For a brief moment, he considered saying nothing, just leaving her to her duties. But then, he walked forward and stopped beside her. "Lila," he said, his voice softer than usual. She looked up, startled by his sudden presence. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her voice steady. "I did what you said," he replied. "I handled the meeting differently. And it worked." Lila didn't say anything at first. She simply nodded. "I know," she said quietly, almost as if she had expected it all along. Dominic stared at her, his mind racing. "You were right," he said, almost to himself. "There's more to power than I thought." Lila looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. There was a brief moment of silence before she spoke. "Power comes from within, Dominic. It's not about what you show on the outside. It's about understanding the situation, knowing when to act, and when to let things unfold." Dominic stood there for a moment, processing her words. He had never expected to hear this from her. In a world built on power and fear, her wisdom was something he had never anticipated. And yet, it had changed everything. Days passed after Dominic's quiet admission, but the change in his mindset was evident. The mansion, once filled with the hum of power and tension, now seemed to hum with something else. A subtle shift. A change in the atmosphere that even the staff could feel. Dominic, despite his usual composed and ruthless persona, now approached his business with a new perspective. It was a strange feeling for him, the idea of being more than just a feared boss. The meetings that followed were different. He no longer relied on intimidation alone. He began listening more, observing carefully, and using subtle strategies he had never employed before. The results were astonishing. Deals that would have required months of negotiation were now being completed in days. Rivals who once feared him were now wary of his calm, calculating demeanor. It was a level of control he had never imagined. Power that came not from fear, but from respect. Yet, despite his success, there was something that bothered him. It wasn't the change in how people saw him. It was the change in how he saw Lila. Her words had planted a seed of doubt in his mind, but also curiosity. How had she known all this? How had she come to understand power in a way that he, someone who had been surrounded by it his whole life, never had? His thoughts often drifted to her. He would find himself standing in the doorway of the kitchen, watching her move with quiet confidence. She was no longer just a maid. She was someone who had changed his view of the world, someone who had made him question everything he knew about strength and weakness. He couldn't help but wonder what else she knew, what other insights she had to offer. Dominic had always believed that the strong made the rules, that power was a visible force. But now, after weeks of reflection, he was beginning to see the flaws in his thinking. Power, true power, wasn't just about what you could see. It was about understanding what others couldn't see, about knowing when to act and when to remain silent. It was about strategy, influence, and control. And Lila had understood that all along. The realization gnawed at him, and he found himself seeking her out more often. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Dominic found himself standing in the hallway outside her small quarters. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if he was doing the right thing. But then, pushing aside his doubts, he knocked. "Lila," he said when she opened the door. She looked surprised, but said nothing. "I need to talk to you," he continued, his voice uncharacteristically soft. Lila stepped aside, allowing him into her room. The small space was simple but neat, a far cry from the luxurious surroundings of the mansion's other rooms. "What's on your mind, sir?" she asked, her voice steady. Dominic hesitated before speaking. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he said slowly. "About what you said." She raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "You were right," he said, almost reluctantly. "I've been going about things all wrong. I've been using fear to control people, thinking that power is something you can see, something you can impose. But you made me realize something. Power is more than that. It's about influence, understanding, and knowing when to act." Lila remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I've been wondering," he said, his voice lowering, "how you know all this. How you learned to think this way." Lila didn't answer immediately. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. Dominic felt a pang of frustration. He had always been able to control any situation, but here he was, standing before a woman who had quietly, without ever asking for anything in return, turned his entire worldview upside down. Finally, Lila spoke. "I didn't learn it," she said quietly. "It's not something you can learn in books or from watching others. It's something you understand when you've had to survive. When you've had to live without the luxury of power, you learn how to work with what you've got. You learn how to make yourself heard without raising your voice." Dominic felt a wave of realization hit him. It was the same thing she had said that day in the dining room. Power wasn't just about force. It was about understanding the world around you and using that understanding to influence others. For the first time, Dominic saw Lila not as the maid, but as someone with far more wisdom than he had ever given her credit for. "You've been hiding this from me all along," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I thought I was the one with all the answers, but you've had the answers all along." Lila didn't respond, but the briefest of smiles crossed her face. It wasn't pride or arrogance. It was simply the quiet acknowledgement of a truth that had been hidden in plain sight. In that moment, Dominic realized something profound. He had spent his life building an empire based on fear, on strength, and on brute force. But now, in front of him, was the realization that true strength came from something much deeper. It came from understanding the world, understanding others, and using that knowledge to wield influence without ever needing to raise a hand. Dominic left her room that night with a new sense of purpose. His empire was no longer just about intimidation. It was about influence, strategy, and respect. And he knew that the person who had shown him this new way of thinking was someone he would never overlook again. The days following their conversation seemed to drag on in a quiet tension. Dominic could feel something changing within him, but he didn't know what to do with it. He had always been the one in control, the one who called the shots, and yet, since that conversation with Lila, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about power. His usual strategies were no longer enough, and the world that once felt certain was now filled with uncertainty. It wasn't just about dominating others anymore. There was a different kind of strength he had begun to consider, one that came from understanding, from being patient, from listening. But even as he began to apply Lila's advice in his professional dealings, something about their dynamic continued to stir him. Lila was still the same woman she had always been, quiet, humble, and invisible to most. But now, there was an unspoken shift between them. The respect he had always demanded from others was now something he found himself giving to her. She was no longer just a maid in his eyes. She was someone who had seen through his facade, someone who had opened his eyes to a world beyond brute force and fear. One afternoon, as Dominic walked through the mansion, he found himself stopping at the kitchen doorway. It was where Lila often worked, and as usual, she was moving about quietly, her movements graceful and efficient. The sun poured through the windows, casting long shadows across the countertops. He had grown used to seeing her in this setting, but today, there was a difference. Today, he saw her not as a servant, but as someone who had changed his perspective in ways he never thought possible. "Lila," he said, his voice breaking the silence. She turned to look at him, her eyes meeting his with the same quiet resolve she always had. "Sir?" she asked, her voice soft, but steady. Dominic hesitated for a moment. He had never spoken to her like this before, never addressed her in a way that acknowledged her intelligence, her strength. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said slowly, walking into the kitchen. "And I realized something." Lila waited, her hands still as she looked at him, curious but unbothered. "You were right," he continued. "Power isn't about intimidation or control. It's about understanding, about knowing how to navigate the world around you without forcing your way through it." Lila didn't respond immediately, but there was a slight change in her expression, a small nod, as if she had known this all along. Dominic felt a pang of frustration. How had she known this when he, someone who had spent his life in a world of power, had not? "I've never really thought about it that way," he admitted. "I've always believed that strength comes from force, from domination. But now, I see that there's another way." Lila looked at him for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. "You've been living in a world where you've always had the upper hand," she said quietly. "It's hard to see anything different when that's all you've ever known." Dominic looked at her, feeling the weight of her words. "I've made a lot of mistakes," he said, more to himself than to her. "I've let my power control me. And in doing so, I've lost sight of what really matters." The realization hit him harder than he had expected. He had spent so many years building an empire on fear, thinking that it was the only way to survive. But now, he saw that there was another path, one that he had never considered, and it had been standing right in front of him. All along. Lila didn't speak for a moment, letting the silence settle between them. Then, she simply said, "It's not too late to change." Dominic looked at her, a mix of gratitude and confusion in his eyes. "You've been right all along," he said, "and I think I've just begun to realize that." For a long moment, they stood there, the quiet of the kitchen enveloping them. There was no fanfare, no dramatic shift in the air. But something had changed. Something was different. Dominic knew that he couldn't go back to the way things were. The world he had built with fear and force was crumbling, but it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new, something that would take time to build, but would be far more lasting. "I want to learn more," Dominic said finally, his voice firm. "I want to understand. I want to know how to lead without fear." Lila nodded, her expression softening. "Then you'll have to start by listening. Really listening." Dominic couldn't help but smile, a small, genuine smile. It was the first time in years that he felt truly hopeful. The next step wouldn't be easy, but with Lila's guidance, he knew he was ready to walk down this new path. He had started to see the world differently, and now, he was ready to change the way he led. The future, he realized, wasn't about control. It was about understanding. And for the first time in his life, Dominic Castellano was ready to lead with something other than fear. A few weeks had passed since Dominic's admission to Lila, and the change in him was starting to show. He was no longer the same man who walked into his mansion with an air of control and superiority. There was a quiet shift in the way he carried himself, less force, more observation. His meetings were still as intense as ever, but now he asked questions rather than just giving orders. He found himself analyzing situations more deeply, considering perspectives he had never thought about before. His empire was still as powerful as it had been, but the way he led had changed. It wasn't long before he decided to take a deeper step. He knew that the advice Lila had given him was more than just a suggestion. It was a turning point, a chance to break free from the old patterns he had relied on for so long. But he also knew that this was not just about making his business dealings smoother. It was about something more personal. He had started seeing Lila differently, and the realization hit him harder than he expected. She had always been more than just the maid. She was wise, thoughtful, and, as he had learned, far more powerful than he had ever given her credit for. One day, after a long meeting with a rival family, Dominic found himself walking toward the kitchen again. The mansion felt different now. There was a sense of calm he had never experienced in the past. As he stepped into the kitchen, he found Lila preparing lunch. Her movements were as graceful as always, but now, he noticed the way she worked with purpose, her every action deliberate. She didn't look up at first, but when she heard his footsteps, she turned, her eyes meeting his. "Sir?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "Lila," Dominic said, his voice surprisingly calm. He paused for a moment before continuing. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said." She said nothing, simply waiting for him to continue. "I've made changes in how I run things," he said, looking directly at her. "And it's working. But there's more to it than just business. I need to understand more." Lila looked at him, her expression neutral. "What do you want to understand?" she asked. Dominic hesitated for a moment. "How do you see the world?" he asked. The question caught Lila off guard, but she didn't show it. She set down the knife she had been using to chop vegetables and looked at him thoughtfully. "I see the world as a place where people often forget that there's more to strength than what they can see. They rely on their physical power or their position in life to get what they want. But the real strength is in understanding. Understanding others, understanding yourself, and knowing how to navigate everything that happens around you." Dominic nodded, his mind racing. This was more than just a philosophical idea. It was the way Lila lived her life, the way she had been able to rise above the limitations others had placed on her. "You've been living your life in a way that I never thought was possible," he said quietly. "You've always been so calm, so certain. I never understood it until now." Lila looked at him for a long moment, then spoke again. "It's not about certainty," she said softly. "It's about knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. Knowing when to push and when to pull back. People who are truly powerful don't need to show it to everyone. They know how to get what they want without ever making a scene." Dominic thought about her words, about the way they had changed his approach to everything. The realization was profound. He had spent so many years building an empire based on fear, using his presence to intimidate and control. But now, he saw how limiting that had been. Lila had shown him a different way, a way that didn't rely on force, but on influence and understanding. "I've been thinking about something else," Dominic said after a pause. "You've changed the way I think about leadership, and I want to do more than just change how I handle business. I want to change the way I lead people." Lila raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "I want to lead by example," Dominic said, his voice steady. "I don't want to be the kind of leader who is feared. I want to be the kind of leader who is respected, who knows how to inspire people to follow without force." Lila was silent for a moment, her eyes locked on his. She had always seen him as a man of great power, but now, there was a vulnerability in his expression that she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't weakness, but it was something different, something that made him more human. "It's not easy," Lila said, her voice gentle. "Changing how you lead, changing how you see the world, it takes time. But it's possible." Dominic smiled slightly. "I know, but for the first time, I'm ready to put in the work." As the days went by, Dominic found himself making more and more decisions that were in line with this new way of thinking. He began listening to his associates, engaging with them on a deeper level, and offering support rather than control. His relationships with others grew stronger, and his business flourished in ways he hadn't anticipated. But the biggest change of all was the one that had occurred inside him. He no longer saw power as something that could be wielded through fear. He saw it as something that came from understanding, from patience, and from the ability to inspire others to be their best. And it was all because of Lila, the quiet maid who had opened his eyes to a new world. It had been several months since Dominic had started seeing things differently, and his transformation had become more than just personal. It was professional, too. His empire, once built on the foundations of fear and intimidation, was now evolving into something more intricate, more refined. Dominic had begun to engage with his allies and rivals alike, no longer relying on his usual methods of coercion. Instead, he focused on listening and understanding. He was no longer just the Mafia boss who made decisions behind closed doors. He was becoming the kind of leader who inspired loyalty, not through fear, but through respect and genuine influence. But while his approach to business had shifted, there was still something missing. He had gained respect, sure, but there was one relationship that still haunted him, the one with Lila. His growing admiration for her wasn't just about her intelligence anymore. It was about something deeper, something he hadn't been willing to admit until now. Over the past few months, Dominic had found himself thinking about her more often than he cared to admit. She had shown him a new way of leading, a new way of thinking, but she had also shown him the quiet strength that came from living in the shadows, never asking for anything, yet holding the power to change everything with just a few words. One evening, Dominic found himself standing outside Lila's quarters once again. It had become a habit, one he never thought he would develop. He knocked softly, and when she answered, there was a brief moment of hesitation between them. "Lila," Dominic said, his voice unexpectedly soft. "Can we talk?" She stepped aside, her eyes meeting his with an unreadable expression, and he entered her room. It was still simple, still modest, yet there was an odd comfort in the space. It reminded him of everything he had overlooked in the past, the quiet moments, the humble lives, the things that weren't flashy but were infinitely more valuable than anything he had chased for so long. "What's on your mind?" Lila asked, her voice steady but curious. Dominic hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about what you've done for me, what you've taught me. I've changed, Lila. I know I have. I see things differently now. But there's still something I don't fully understand." Lila listened intently, her posture relaxed, yet her eyes focused on him. "What's that?" she asked. "I don't understand why you did it," Dominic said, the question hanging in the air. "Why did you help me? You never asked for anything in return. You never tried to take anything from me. And yet, you gave me everything I needed." Lila was silent for a moment, her eyes steady as she met his gaze. "I didn't do it for anything in return," she said finally. "I did it because I saw that you were more than just the person everyone feared. I saw that you were someone who could change, someone who could lead in a different way. You just needed to realize it." Dominic looked at her, his mind processing her words. "But why me?" he asked quietly. "Why me of all people?" Lila smiled softly, her expression warm yet distant. "Because everyone has the capacity to change, Dominic. Even the ones who seem the least likely. I saw something in you. Something that told me you could lead differently, if you were willing to listen." Dominic let her words sink in. There it was again, the quiet wisdom that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. She wasn't just helping him for the sake of helping him. She was showing him a way to become someone better, someone who could change the world around him without relying on fear or force. It was a revelation, one that Dominic had never considered. For the first time, he realized that true leadership wasn't about taking control. It was about allowing others to see what they were capable of, and then inspiring them to be better. "You're right," he said, finally understanding. "I've spent so many years trying to control everything around me, trying to make others follow me out of fear. But I've realized that the best way to lead is to make them want to follow, to earn their respect." Lila nodded, her gaze never wavering. "Exactly. People don't follow because they're afraid. They follow because they believe in you, because they trust you to guide them." Dominic took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the change within him. It wasn't easy to admit, but he could no longer deny it. The world he had built on fear and power was crumbling, and in its place, something better was emerging. It was a new kind of strength, one rooted in understanding and respect. "I've been selfish," he admitted, his voice low. "I've been focused on what I want, on building something for myself. But I see now that leadership isn't about that. It's about building something bigger than yourself. It's about creating something that lasts." Lila's eyes softened, and she gave him a small, approving nod. "That's the first step," she said quietly. Dominic smiled, a genuine, humble smile. It was the first time in years that he felt truly at peace with himself. He had always prided himself on being the boss, the one everyone feared. But now, he understood that real power came from within, and it came from being able to inspire others to rise with you, not drag them along. As he turned to leave, Dominic looked back at Lila, a sense of gratitude flooding through him. "Thank you," he said simply, "for showing me the way." She didn't respond with words, but her smile said everything. And in that moment, Dominic knew that the path he was walking now was one that would lead him to places he had never imagined. Places where power was defined not by fear, but by understanding, trust, and respect. Weeks passed, and Dominic's transformation became increasingly visible. His leadership style had shifted completely. No longer was he the domineering figure who ruled by fear, but rather a leader who was respected for his insight and ability to inspire loyalty. His business was thriving, his associates were more cooperative, and the tension that had once filled the halls of his mansion seemed to evaporate, replaced by a calm, almost serene atmosphere. But with the progress came a growing unease, an inner conflict Dominic couldn't shake. He had changed in so many ways, but one thing was still weighing on his mind: Lila. She had guided him through this transformation, showing him a side of leadership and power he had never seen before. But despite all the changes in him, there was still something he had yet to confront: their dynamic, the unspoken connection that had slowly begun to form between them. He had always seen her as his subordinate, someone to be respected for her intelligence, but not as someone on equal footing. But now, as his understanding of power had evolved, he began to see her differently. It was a shift he hadn't anticipated. Lila, who had always been the quiet maid, now seemed like an equal in his eyes, someone who had not only changed the way he thought about leadership, but someone who had changed the way he viewed the world. Yet, Dominic struggled with this new reality. He had spent so long in a world of dominance and control, and now, there was a part of him that wasn't sure how to handle the change. He couldn't ignore the way his feelings toward her had shifted, but he wasn't sure if those feelings were mutual. It was confusing, to say the least. One evening, as Dominic was finishing up a meeting with his inner circle, he found himself walking through the mansion, deep in thought. He knew he had to address what was growing between him and Lila. The tension had reached a point where ignoring it was no longer an option. His footsteps echoed through the empty hallway as he made his way to the kitchen. It was late, and Lila was still there, preparing a meal for the staff. She looked up as he entered, her expression neutral but warm. "Sir?" she asked, her voice calm. "I need to talk to you," Dominic said, his voice more hesitant than he would have liked. Lila nodded and set down the knife she was holding. "Of course." Dominic took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before speaking. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened lately," he began. "About how I've changed. About what you've taught me." Lila stayed quiet, waiting for him to continue. "I've learned a lot from you," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You've shown me a different way to lead. A better way." Lila smiled slightly, but said nothing. Dominic shifted his weight, feeling the weight of his words pressing down on him. "But it's more than just that," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "It's about us. About the way I see you now. I can't ignore it any longer." Lila's expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly. Dominic hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. "I've spent my whole life building a reputation based on fear, on control. But the more I've gotten to know you, the more I realize how much I've been missing. You've shown me a side of power that I never understood, a side of myself that I never knew existed." Lila's gaze softened, but she didn't interrupt. Dominic took a step closer, his heart racing as he finally allowed himself to admit what had been growing inside him for months. "I'm not just talking about leadership, Lila," he said, his voice low. "I'm talking about how I feel about you. I've tried to ignore it, but I can't. Not anymore." Lila looked at him, her expression calm but curious. "You've changed me," Dominic continued. "You've made me see the world differently, and you've made me see you differently. And I think I care about you." There was a long silence between them, and for a moment, Dominic wondered if he had said too much. But then, Lila spoke, her voice gentle. "I know," she said simply. "I've known for a while." Dominic looked at her, stunned. "You knew?" he asked, his voice filled with surprise. "Yes," Lila replied softly. "I knew. I've seen the change in you, Dominic. And I've seen how hard you've worked to become someone better." She paused, then added, "I respect you, more than you know. And I care about you too." Dominic felt a wave of relief wash over him, but also something else, a deep sense of gratitude. In that moment, he realized that he wasn't alone in this journey. They had both changed, but not just because of their circumstances. They had changed because they had allowed each other to see the world through a different lens, to embrace the possibility of something better, something deeper. Dominic reached out, his hand resting gently on hers. "I'm glad," he said, his voice soft. "I'm glad I met you, Lila." You've changed my life. Lila's eyes met his, and for the first time, there was no need for words. They both understood. The bond they had formed was something unique, something that went beyond power, beyond leadership. It was a connection built on respect, trust, and understanding. And as Dominic stood there, holding her hand, he knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one where both of them could truly rise together. The next few weeks were filled with changes, subtle but unmistakable. Dominic had never been one to sit idly by, and with each passing day, his transformation into a new kind of leader became clearer. He had moved away from using fear and intimidation, and instead began to focus on earning the trust and respect of those around him. His associates had noticed, and although there were some who doubted the shift, many others were intrigued by his newfound sense of understanding. His meetings with rival families were now different. No longer did he storm into the room demanding respect. Instead, he entered with quiet confidence, listened carefully, and used his words to command attention. The results were staggering. Deals that once required intense negotiation now unfolded with surprising ease. Dominic had become a man who could not only dictate terms but also listen, negotiate, and, in a way, lead by example. But as his professional world flourished, a new challenge arose, a challenge that was personal. The dynamic between him and Lila, his trusted maid, had shifted, and neither of them could ignore it. They had shared moments of understanding, but the nature of their relationship was no longer just about business or advice. As they grew closer, the unspoken bond between them deepened, and Dominic couldn't help but question where it was leading. It wasn't just respect anymore. It was something more complicated, something neither of them had fully acknowledged. Dominic knew it was time to address it. One evening, after a particularly long and successful meeting with a rival family, he found himself once again walking down the familiar hallways of the mansion. His thoughts, which had been consumed by strategy and business for so long, now turned toward Lila. He knew they needed to talk. He had always been in control of his life, but Lila had changed him. She had opened his eyes to something far more powerful than anything he had ever known: vulnerability, honesty, and respect. And now, he had to confront what that meant. When he entered the kitchen, he found her there, just as he had expected. She was working quietly, preparing something for the staff, but when she saw him, her expression softened. "Dominic," she said, her voice gentle. "Is something wrong?" He stood there for a moment, watching her. The familiarity of the space, the calm in the air, seemed to reflect how far he had come. He had spent so much of his life running from emotions, from connection, but Lila had changed that. And now, there was a question in his heart that he could no longer ignore. "Lila," he began, his voice a little uncertain. "I've been thinking about everything, about how much has changed, and about us." She paused, a slight frown crossing her face. She had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure how to handle it. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly. "You've changed my life," Dominic said, his words carefully chosen. "You've shown me a different way to lead, to live. And now, I can't help but wonder where this is leading us." Lila's heart skipped a beat. She had felt the change too, but she had been unsure of how to address it. She had never imagined that this journey would lead her to a place where the lines between professionalism and personal feelings blurred so completely. "Dominic," she said softly, "I've always been here, quietly observing, never asking for anything. But I've watched you change. I've seen the man you've become." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a more personal tone. "I never imagined I'd find someone who could make me question everything I thought I knew about leadership, about power," he said. "You've helped me become a better leader, a better man. And I think I've begun to care about you in a way I never expected." Lila's breath caught in her throat. She had known that she had begun to feel something more, but hearing him say it aloud made her heart race. "Dominic, she began, but he interrupted her gently. "I don't know where this goes," he said, "but I know that I want to find out." She stared at him for a long moment, her mind racing. The past few months had been full of change, not just for him, but for her as well. She had watched him grow, watched him become someone different, someone she had begun to respect, even admire. And now, it seemed like there was more than just respect between them. "I think I've always cared about you, Dominic," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. but I've never allowed myself to act on it. I've always kept my distance. Why? He asked, genuinely curious. Because I knew the kind of man you were, Lila said. You were someone who led with power and force, and I didn't want to be a part of that. But you've changed, and so have I. And I think. She paused, searching his eyes for the right words. I think I want to see where this goes too. Dominic reached out, gently taking her hand in his. The touch was simple, yet meaningful, an acknowledgement of everything they had both been through and everything that was yet to come. In that moment, as their hands intertwined, Dominic realized that he had been right to let go of the past. Leadership wasn't about control. It was about connection, understanding, and, above all, respect. He had learned that from Lila. And now, he was ready to walk beside her, not as the Mafia boss and the Maid, but as two people who had changed each other's lives in ways they could never have imagined. The future was uncertain, but with Lila by his side, Dominic felt ready to face whatever came next. Weeks had passed since that pivotal moment in the kitchen, and things between Dominic and Lila had settled into a quiet understanding. The distance between them that had once seemed so vast now felt almost non-existent. They had shared moments, exchanged words, and connected on a level neither of them had anticipated. But despite their growing closeness, there remained an unspoken tension in the air, one that neither of them had addressed yet, but both knew was there. Dominic had never been one to hesitate when it came to business or decisions, but this was different. He had never truly allowed himself to be vulnerable in his life, and certainly never with someone like Lila, who had started as his employee. Yet, now, after all that had happened, he couldn't deny the feelings he had for her. They weren't just admiration or respect, they were deeper than that, and that terrified him. One evening, Dominic found himself once again in the mansion's grand hallway, staring down the familiar path that led to the kitchen. He had thought about this moment for days, but now, standing here, he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. But he knew that if he didn't speak up now, he would never have the courage to do so again. He knocked softly at the kitchen door. Lila opened it, her usual calm demeanor never wavering. But there was something in her eyes that made Dominic pause. An awareness, a quiet understanding. Dominic, she said, her voice gentle. What's on your mind? He stood there for a moment, unsure of how to begin. Finally, he stepped into the room, his gaze locking with hers. I've been thinking a lot, he said, his voice low. About everything. About how far we've both come. Lila didn't say anything, simply waiting for him to continue. I never thought I'd be here, feeling the way I do, he confessed, his words more vulnerable than he had ever allowed himself to be before. I've spent so much of my life trying to control everything, and now, I can't help but feel like I've lost control of this. He gestured between them. I don't know what this is, but I know it's real, and it's something I can't ignore anymore. Lila's gaze softened, and she stepped closer to him. Dominic, you've changed. You've learned to let go, to trust, and to lead with respect. It's not easy, but you're doing it. She paused, then added, you don't have to control everything. You've learned that the best way to lead is through understanding and connection. And sometimes, the hardest thing is accepting that you don't have all the answers. Dominic looked at her, his heart pounding. He had never imagined that the quiet maid he had once overlooked could be the one to make him realize his own shortcomings. But she had. And now, he knew he had to be honest with her, with himself. Lila, he said, his voice a little unsteady. I'm not asking for anything from you. But I have to ask, can we be more than what we are now? I can't keep pretending that what's between us is just about respect or admiration. I know how I feel, and I can't ignore it anymore. Lila's heart skipped a beat as she looked at him. She had known that this conversation was coming, but hearing him say it aloud sent a rush of emotions through her. For so long, she had kept her distance, kept her feelings hidden, afraid of what would happen if she let herself care. But now, as she looked at Dominic, she realized that the walls she had built around her heart were starting to crumble. I've never asked for more, Dominic, she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. I've always kept to my place, but I've felt it too. What's between us, it's different. And it scares me, just like it scares you. Dominic's breath caught in his throat. So, what do we do now, he asked, his voice low. I don't have all the answers, Lila replied, her eyes locked on his. But I think we both need to trust that whatever happens next, we'll face it together. No more hiding, No more pretending. Let's see where this goes. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them moved. But then, slowly, Dominic reached out and took her hand in his. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was meaningful. It was a promise, a silent agreement between them that they were ready to take the next step, whatever that step may be. In that moment, Dominic realized that everything he had built, the empire, the power, the wealth, it all paled in comparison to what he was feeling now. This was something real, something lasting. And as he looked into Lila's eyes, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The future was no longer about control, about power. It was about understanding, about connection. And with Lila by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that they were stronger together than they had ever been apart. A few months had passed since that night in the kitchen, and with each passing day, Dominic and Lila's connection deepened. Dominic had never expected to find someone like Lila, not only in his life, but in his heart. She had changed him in ways he couldn't have imagined when they first met. He had once lived his life surrounded by fear and control, but now, with Lila by his side, he had begun to see the world through a different lens, one where power wasn't about domination, but understanding. As their relationship grew stronger, Dominic found himself relying on her more and more, not just for advice, but for support, for guidance, and even for comfort. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this way about anyone. Lila, on the other hand, had never expected to become so entangled in the world of the Mafia, especially not with someone like Dominic Castellano. But as the days went on, she saw the changes in him, and she couldn't deny that her own feelings had begun to shift. She had always kept a distance, keeping her emotions at bay, but now, the walls she had built around herself were slowly starting to come down. Their relationship was still complicated. After all, he was the Mafia boss, and she was his maid. But in her heart, Lila knew they were something more than just that. One evening, Dominic called Lila into his office. The mansion was quiet, and the soft light from the chandeliers cast a warm glow over the room. As Lila entered, she noticed how different things were. The tension that had once filled the air whenever he was around had dissipated, replaced by something more comfortable. Dominic looked up from his desk, his gaze meeting hers. "Lila," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight of something unspoken. "I need to talk to you." Lila stepped forward, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "Of course," she replied, her voice calm. "What's on your mind?" Dominic stood up from his desk, walking toward her. There was a hesitance in his steps, something that was rare for him. He had always been the one in control, the one with all the answers, but now, in front of Lila, he felt something different. "I've been thinking," he began, his words slow and deliberate. "About everything. About the way we've changed. About how I've changed." Lila didn't respond, simply waiting for him to continue. "I never thought I'd be here," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "I never thought I'd be the kind of man who needed someone else's guidance, someone else's perspective. But you've shown me what true power really is." He paused for a moment, his gaze intense, as though he was searching for the right words. "I've spent my whole life running from what I truly needed. I built an empire on fear, on control, and I thought that was enough. But now I see that it's not. What's been missing in my life is real connection, real trust. And I want that. With you." Lila's heart skipped a beat as she processed his words. For so long, she had seen him as the powerful, ruthless Mafia boss, the one who controlled everything. But now, here he was, admitting vulnerability, admitting that he needed her in ways he hadn't before. She had never imagined this moment, never thought she would be the one to change someone like Dominic, but she had. And in a way, she had changed too. "Dominic," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "I never expected this either. I never expected to be a part of your world, to be a part of your life in this way." She took a deep breath, her hands clasped in front of her. "But I see now that we've both changed. You've learned to lead with respect, to let go of the control that once defined you. And I've learned to trust, to open myself up to someone who truly sees me, who values me." Dominic took a step closer, his presence overwhelming yet comforting at the same time. "Lila," he said, his voice low and filled with sincerity, "I know we've been living in two different worlds for so long, but I can't ignore what's between us. I don't want to hide from it anymore." Lila looked up at him, her heart racing. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want, Dominic?" He took her hand gently in his thumb brushing over her skin as he looked at her with a tenderness she had never seen before. "I want you," he said simply. "I want to be with you, Lila. Not just as the Mafia boss and the maid, but as two people who have learned to see each other for who we truly are." There was a long silence as Lila processed his words. She had never imagined herself in this position, never thought that she could be with someone like Dominic. But now, looking at him, she saw the man he had become, the man who was capable of love, of vulnerability, and of true change. "I want that too," she said softly, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I want to be with you, Dominic. But we have to take it slow. This is new for both of us." Dominic nodded, his smile warm and understanding. "We'll take it one step at a time," he agreed. "But no matter what, we'll do it together." As they stood there, hand in hand, Dominic and Lila both knew that their journey together was just beginning. The road ahead would be full of challenges, but they were no longer just two people from different worlds. They were partners, and together, they would face whatever came next, knowing that their connection, built on respect, trust, and love, was stronger than anything they had ever known. The days turned into weeks, and the changes in Dominic were becoming evident to everyone around him. His transformation was more than just a shift in how he handled business. It was a complete reinvention of who he was as a person. He had grown, learned, and adapted, becoming a man who was respected not just for his power, but for his ability to lead with integrity and understanding. His relationship with Lila had blossomed into something neither of them had expected. They were no longer just employer and employee. They were partners, both in life and in leadership. Their bond was built on trust, respect, and love, and it was something neither of them had ever imagined could exist between them. But as with all changes, there were moments of doubt and fear. Despite everything, Dominic couldn't help but feel a gnawing uncertainty in the back of his mind. The man he had once been, the man who ruled with an iron fist, still lingered inside him. And as much as he had learned from Lila, as much as he had come to understand the true meaning of power, he feared that old habits might resurface. He was still the Mafia boss, after all, a role that came with its own set of challenges. And while he had made peace with many of the darker aspects of his past, he couldn't shake the fear that he might one day lose control again. One evening, as Dominic and Lila sat together in his study, the weight of the silence between them was palpable. The mansion felt quiet, the usual hum of activity having died down for the night. Dominic looked at Lila, his gaze soft but filled with something unspoken. She noticed the shift in him, the way his shoulders were tense, his brow furrowed as if he were lost in thought. "Dominic," she said gently, "what's on your mind?" He paused for a moment, unsure of how to begin. He had always been a man of action, not words, and talking about his feelings was something he had never been good at. But Lila had changed him. She had shown him the power of vulnerability, the strength in being honest with oneself and others. And now, he realized that it was time to be honest with her. "I've been thinking," he started, his voice low and hesitant, "about everything. About us, about how far we've come, and about how much I've changed." Lila watched him carefully, her expression calm but understanding. "You've changed in a way I never thought possible," she said softly. "But I can see it, Dominic. You're not the same man you were before." He nodded, but the doubt in his eyes remained. "I know," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "But there are moments, Lila, when I feel like that old version of me is still there. The one who controls everything, the one who uses fear to get what he wants. And I'm scared. I'm scared that one day, I'll lose control again, that I'll go back to being that man." Lila's heart ached for him. She had seen the change in him, the man who had learned to lead with kindness and understanding. She had seen him let go of the past, let go of the need to control everything. But she also understood that his fears were real. The scars from his past were still fresh, and even though he had changed, those old instincts couldn't be erased overnight. "Dominic," she said softly, taking his hand in hers, "you've come so far. And I know it's hard to believe sometimes, but you're not that man anymore. You've proven that time and time again. It's okay to be afraid, but you have to trust yourself. You've already made the change, now you just have to believe in it." He looked at her, searching her face for any sign of doubt, but all he saw was certainty. Her unwavering faith in him was something he had never imagined he would have in his life. It was the one thing that anchored him, the one thing that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he was capable of something better. "I want to believe you," Dominic said, his voice thick with emotion. "But sometimes, I feel like I'm just one mistake away from falling back into my old ways." Lila squeezed his hand, her voice firm yet gentle. "You're not alone in this. I'm here with you. We're in this together." The sincerity in her words struck him deeply. It wasn't just her kindness or her strength that had changed him. It was the fact that she believed in him even when he couldn't believe in himself. "I don't know if I can ever truly shake off my past," he said quietly, "but I do know that I want to try. And I want to try for you, for us." Lila smiled softly, her heart swelling with affection for him. "You don't have to do it alone," she whispered. "We're a team now, Dominic. And I believe in you." In that moment, Dominic realized that the fear he had been carrying was not something he had to face alone. With Lila by his side, he knew he could keep moving forward, one step at a time. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in his life, Dominic felt like he was ready to walk it, not as the Mafia boss who controlled everything, but as a man who had learned to let go, to trust, and to love. And with Lila by his side, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, stronger than ever before. Time had passed, and with it, both Dominic and Lila had forged a life together that neither had imagined possible. Dominic had come to understand what it truly meant to lead, not through fear or control, but through trust, respect, and collaboration. His empire, still powerful, was no longer built on intimidation, but on the belief that true strength came from empowering those around him. The tension that had once lingered in the air whenever he walked into a room had vanished, replaced by a calm confidence. He was no longer the same man who had relied on brute force to keep control. The weight of his past still lingered in the back of his mind, but he now knew how to carry it without letting it define him. The most unexpected change, however, had come in the form of his relationship with Lila. She had once been just the maid, an invisible part of his world, but now she was his partner in every sense of the word. They had built something real between them, something that wasn't just rooted in respect and admiration, but in love. As they stood side by side, facing the world, they knew that the bond they shared was unbreakable. But as with any new beginning, there were still challenges ahead. The world they lived in wasn't one that easily accepted change, and there were those who would try to drag them back to the way things used to be. But Dominic was no longer afraid. He had Lila by his side, and together, they had proven that they could face anything. One afternoon, as the sun began to set over the city, Dominic stood by the window of his office, looking out over the skyline. It was a view he had seen countless times before, but now, it felt different. He could see the potential for something more, something bigger than the life he had built for himself. He wasn't just a Mafia boss anymore. He was a man who had learned to lead with his heart, who had learned that true strength wasn't about dominating others, but about lifting them up. Lila walked into the room, her presence as comforting as it had always been. She had changed, too. No longer the quiet, reserved maid, but a woman who stood with confidence and purpose. She was his equal, and together, they had built a life that was stronger than anything either of them could have imagined. "You've been quiet today," Lila said, her voice soft but filled with concern. Dominic turned to face her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Just thinking," he said, his voice thoughtful, "about everything we've accomplished, everything we've been through." She stepped closer, her eyes meeting his with understanding. "And?" she asked. "And about how far we've come," Dominic replied. "I never thought I'd be here, Lila. I never thought I'd be standing beside someone like you. Someone who has shown me a new way of seeing the world." Lila's heart swelled with emotion, but she remained quiet, allowing him to continue. "You've made me a better man, Lila," Dominic said, his voice filled with sincerity. "And together, we've built something real, something that will last." She reached out, taking his hand in hers. "We've built this together," she said softly, her voice steady and full of conviction. "And we'll continue to build it. Together." Dominic nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude and love. "I can't imagine my life without you," he said quietly. "You've shown me that. Love, trust, and respect are the real sources of power. I'm not the same man I was when we first met. Lila smiled, her gaze soft but firm. And that's what makes you who you are now. The man who leads with his heart. The man who knows that true strength comes from the people around him. They stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of their journey settling between them. The world outside was changing, but in that moment, Dominic and Lila knew that no matter what came next, they had everything they needed to face it. The challenges they had once feared now seemed small in comparison to the strength they had found in each other. Dominic reached up and gently cupped Lila's face in his hands, his thumb brushing against her cheek. "We've come a long way," he said softly. "And I know that together, we can face anything." Lila nodded, her heart full as she looked into his eyes. "We always have," she said, her voice full of conviction. "And we always will." As they stood there, united, Dominic knew that their future was no longer defined by the power he had once sought. It was defined by the love they shared, the trust they had built, and the strength they had found in each other. The life they had created together was just beginning, and whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, stronger than ever. They had built something more than an empire, they had built a legacy, and that legacy would endure, not because of the fear they had once commanded, but because of the love and respect they had earned.